With the end of World War II, Japan entered a period of great change. The Emperor of Japan himself spoke in his own voice to announce the defeat to the Japanese people. It came as a deep shock to the Japanese people. Feelings of regret, surprise, and relief that the war was over. And there was also anxiety about the upcoming occupation. There was a mixture of emotions among the Japanese people. Many people were not quick to accept the situation. They could only stand there in shock. However, even after Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration, the war did not end immediately. In Okinawa, sporadic resistance continued in some areas. In South Sakhalin and the Tsushima Islands, the Japanese military was fighting back desperately against the invading Soviet forces. In Manchuria, the rapid advance of the Soviet army forced many Kwantung army troops to retreat. The large number of civilians left behind there lived in dire conditions. They were subjected to violence and robbery by the Soviet army. They were taken to Siberia and Central Asia. The Soviets forced them to do labor. As a result, many people were unable to withstand the harsh conditions and lost their lives. As this chaos continued, the Japanese government offered to surrender to the Allies. The Prime Minister at that time was Kantaro Suzuki. He offered to surrender to the Allies. At the same time, he took responsibility and announced the resignation of his cabinet. This forced Japan to elect a new prime minister. Naidoijin Koichi Kido conferred with Kichiro Hiranuma, president of the Privy Council. They decided that they had no choice but to accept the imperial family cabinet. We must go through the procedures that come with surrender. At that time, the Allied forces invaded Japan. If that happens, the military could explode. In order to keep the military in check, we have no choice but to enlist the help of the imperial family. That's what they thought. The person who was chosen was Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko. This was Japan's first imperial family cabinet, whose purpose was to put an end to the chaos that followed immediately after the end of the war. The cabinet of Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko was born. But, of course, he has no political experience. They appointed Fumimaro Konoe as minister without portfolio. He played the role of supporting Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko. In a sense, it is a position similar to that of Deputy Prime Minister. Additionally, anticipating domestic unrest, politicians appointed a Minister of the Interior to be responsible for maintaining security. The person appointed was Iwa Yamazaki, who had previously served as Superintendent General of the Metropolitan Police and Vice Minister of the Interior. They also looked ahead to negotiations with the Allies. They appointed diplomat Mamoru Shigemitsu as Minister of Foreign Affairs in charge of foreign affairs. In this way, a system was established to support Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko. Such was the political policy of Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko cabinet. This was to return Japan from a wartime system to a Heiji system. In other words, it was a return to the pre-war situation. Based on this policy, the Japanese government proceeded with preparations for post-war settlement. Meanwhile, American occupying forces were arriving in Japan one after another. Among them was Field Marshal Douglas MacArthur, who was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. Upon arriving in Japan, he immediately went to Yokohama. At that time, MacArthur had a grand vision of demilitarizing and democratizing Japan. That is to prevent Japan from once again becoming a threat to the world, especially the United States. At the same time, it aims to transform Japan into a democratic, peaceful nation. With this in mind, he sought to advance the occupation policy of Japan. Now, let us shift our focus to Tokyo Bay. There, an American fleet was invading from the Pacific Ocean. They were anchored in Tokyo Bay. Among them was the American battleship Missouri. The surrender ceremony was held on the deck of this battleship. The Japanese government was represented by Minister for Foreign Affairs Mamoru Shigemitsu. On behalf of the Japanese military, Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu signed it. For Japan, it was a historic moment that marked the end of approximately 15 years of war. The ceremony lasted just 20 minutes. Thus, the Allies' occupation of Japan officially began. As a result, the Soviet army occupied the northern part of the Chosin, South Sakhalin, and the Tsushima Islands. American forces occupied the southern part of the Chosin, the Amami Islands, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Ogasawara Islands. These areas were placed under direct military government by the Allies. Taiwan was also returned to China. Japan's sovereignty consisted of 4 islands: Honshu, Hokkaido, Shikoku, and Kyushu. Japanese sovereignty was limited to other small islands designated by the Allies. Japan's territory was returned to the state it was in before the Sino-Japanese War. The signing ceremony of the surrender document has concluded. The Allies' occupation of Japan had finally begun. However, America at this time was in a state of chaos immediately after the end of the war. The reason was that Japan surrendered sooner than they expected.
This is the original American plan. They will attack Japan and destroy the Japanese government. After that, the occupying forces decided to directly govern the country. In other words, they envisioned direct rule over Japan by the occupying forces.
But in reality, Japan surrendered before the Japanese government was destroyed. The US was forced to reconsider its plans. The war ended sooner than expected, leaving the occupying forces ill-prepared to govern. They wanted to achieve their occupation objectives with a minimum of forces and resources. The US changed its policy. They dropped plans for direct political intervention by the occupying forces. They decided on a plan to use the Japanese government to carry out politics. In other words, the occupying forces gave instructions to the Japanese government, and the Japanese government governed the country. Indirect rule was adopted. This change in American policy was made suddenly. This was not shared sufficiently even within the occupying forces. As a result, some thought the original plan, direct rule, would be followed. Some perceived the revised plan to be indirect rule. The occupying forces were in a state of chaos. Richard J. Marshall of the occupying forces was unaware of the change. He announced his intention to impose direct rule over Japan. That is to make English the official language. If you disobey the orders of the occupying forces, you will be put on trial by military tribunal. The occupying forces will issue their own currency. These measures were completely unacceptable to the Japanese government. Upon receiving this notice, the Japanese representative, Tadakatsu Suzuki, protested on the spot. This measure goes against the contents of the Potsdam Declaration, which provides for governance through the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government. He argued that this could lead to further unrest in Japan. However, representatives of the Allied forces rejected the offer. Japan faced the threat of direct rule. The Japanese government must do everything in its power to resolve this situation. That same day, the person in charge of acting as a bridge between the Allied forces and the Japanese government rushed to Yokohama. He attempted a desperate plea to representatives of the Allied forces. As a result, he succeeded in temporarily blocking the announcement of direct rule over Japan. However, this was only a temporary measure. The final decision was in MacArthur's hands. The next day, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu once again traveled to Yokohama. He began negotiations with MacArthur. Shigemitsu, the government of Japan is determined to carry out the Potsdam Declaration in good faith. Direct military government goes beyond the scope of the Potsdam Declaration. This could lead to further confusion within Japan. Rather, it would be more effective for you to use the Japanese government to implement the Potsdam Declaration. He thus persuaded MacArthur and requested the revocation of the decree. To my surprise, MacArthur readily agreed to the idea. We have no intention of destroying Japan or enslaving the Japanese people. Rather, we want to somehow save Japan from this national crisis. With this statement, the threat of direct rule of Japan by the Allies was averted. The Allied forces stationed in Yokohama then advanced to Tokyo. MacArthur also moved to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. The Daiichi Seimei building in front of the Imperial Palace was designated as the headquarters of General Headquarters. It is called GHQ for short. From this base, MacArthur issued a series of directives to the Japanese government. He promoted a large-scale occupation policy across all areas of politics, economy and society. Meanwhile, in the United States itself, the occupation policy for Japan was decided. With President Truman's approval, it was made public. The occupation policy was to promote the demilitarization and democratization of Japan. This is to prevent Japan from once again becoming a threat to America and the world. That is to respect the fundamental human rights of the Japanese people and realize a democratic representative government. Such content was shown. MacArthur worked to create an organization within GHQ to realize this policy. He began to seriously set about building an occupation regime. Thus, at the top of the established occupation system was placed the Far Eastern Commission. The Far Eastern Commission was established in Washington. It was composed of 11 countries, including the chair country, the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and the Soviet Union. The Far Eastern Commission decides the basic policy toward Japan. This policy will be communicated to the U.S. government. The U.S. government gives specific instructions on occupation policy to GHQ. GHQ issues orders and recommendations to the Japanese government. The Japanese government will implement it. This is the approach that was taken. An advisory body to GHQ was established. A Council for Japan, consisting of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union, was established in Tokyo. It served as a sort of Japanese branch of the Far Eastern Commission. In reality, it never had much impact. As can be seen from this occupation system, it is believed that Japan was occupied by the Allies. In reality, American influence was very strong. The United States could veto decisions of the Far Eastern Commission. If another country exercised its veto, the United States could still issue an interim command. The United States was able to issue direct commands to MacArthur. In other words, the occupation of Japan was essentially a sole occupation by the United States. Among them, MacArthur had enormous authority. He often found himself at odds with the U.S. government over its occupation of Japan. At times, he acted on his own initiative. In this situation, MacArthur's wishes were strongly reflected in Japan's occupation policy. The occupation of Japan by the Allies began in earnest. First, GHQ promoted the demilitarization of Japan. They disarmed the Japanese military. They disbanded the Japanese Navy and Army. In addition, they requisitioned munitions factories. Japan's military forces were drastically reduced. Particular attention was given to the investigation of war criminals. This investigation led to the arrests of wartime leaders one after another, head position with Hideki Tojo. Of these, the one that attracted the most attention was Emperor Showa's war responsibility. China, Australia, New Zealand, the Soviet Union, etc. They strongly argued that the Emperor of Japan's war responsibility should be pursued. Even within the United States, there was widespread criticism. However, the American government believed that the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government could be used for indirect rule. The U.S. government had no intention of delving deeply into the Emperor of Japan's war responsibility. At that time, Emperor Showa went to the American embassy and visited MacArthur. MacArthur thought Emperor Showa might beg for his life. Emperor Showa did not beg for his life. At this press conference, Emperor Showa said he took full responsibility for the war decisions and actions. Emperor Showa said that he would leave himself to the judgment of the nations that you represented. It deeply moved MacArthur. MacArthur understood that responsibility for this war was complex. Nevertheless, Emperor Showa was willing to accept full responsibility. Emperor Showa's attitude shook him to his very core. Later, MacArthur said, "The Emperor Showa, who sits before me, was Japan's foremost gentleman in his personal capacity as well." He looked back on that time like this. MacArthur decided that in order to complete the occupation policy, it would be better to maintain the Emperor of Japan system. However, around this time, a divergence began to emerge between the direction of the Japanese government and GHQ. The policy of Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko cabinet was to return to the pre-war state of affairs. Simply put, it was a move back to the original. On the other hand, GHQ felt that simply returning Japan to its pre-war state was not enough. They believed that Japan had to be fundamentally reformed. Simply put, the policy was to move forward with it. This discrepancy was particularly evident in the response to the Peace Preservation Law. The Japanese government wanted to continue the Peace Preservation Law. Those who violated the Peace Preservation Law were sentenced to death or died in prison. The Japanese government has continued to crack down on anti-establishment thoughts and actions. GHQ saw this as a problem. The Human Rights Directive was issued with the aim of ensuring the human rights of the Japanese people. The Human Rights Directive is a command to repeal laws that impede the freedom of speech, assembly, and association. In other words, it means the abolition of the Peace Preservation Law. This means releasing political prisoners, including Communist Party members. That is to protect the human rights of the Japanese people. That is to encourage free discussion about the Emperor of Japan system. It contains such content. The directive was issued suddenly and without prior notice to the Japanese government. Even under indirect rule, GHQ could take coercive measures such as direct rule if necessary. The Japanese government was made to realize this. The cabinet of Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko aimed to restore the pre-war state of affairs. They thought that the Human Rights Directive could not be implemented. They considered this directive an act of distrust in them. Thus, the cabinet of Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko reached a deadlock and resigned en masse. The post-war process was taken over by a new cabinet.